I rise to engage my colleagues, Senator Nelson and Senator Martinez, in a colloquy. And as I do, let me just start off by saying we want to take a moment to discuss some important provisions in the Omnibus bill. I discussed these provisions at length last week on the Senate floor, and I want to give an update as to where things stand today. As I discussed last week, this bill includes three important foreign policy changes with respect to Cuba that have not been subjected to debate in this body. They have not gone to the Foreign Relations Committee. They have not been subjected to a vote in either body. And these modifications deserved a full examination. This had not taken place. Instead, this body would have been forced to swallow these changes in the crudest process I can imagine, without analysis and without inclusion. Since we have been unable to debate the substance of these provisions, I've asked for clarification, along with my colleagues, from the Secretary of the Treasury on the implementation of these provisions, and expressed my concern for the possible implications of them and the unproductive signals they might send to those who are fighting for democratic change on the island. We did this to get clarification on what might have been major loopholes that could have been exploited by individuals or organizations seeking to circumvent the long-standing and necessary economic embargo. In response, Secretary Geithner has provided me with two letters that I ask unanimous consent to be submitted for the record.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered.
Mr. President, Section 620 liberalizes individual travel regulations to Cuba for the promotion of agricultural and medical sales. This provision would systematically broaden the category of licenses available and allow individuals in a self-policing manner to travel to the island under the auspices of selling such supplies. While I am sympathetic to the United States agricultural industry, I remain concerned that the provision was written with the aim not of benefiting the private sector, but rather of undercutting the current travel regulations for individuals and putting a wedge in a broader issue of denying hard currency to the Castro regime. Depending on how this provision was implemented, it could encourage a radical break in existing travel regulations and provide the Castro regime with enhanced financial benefit in the pursuit of its repressive policies. As a result, we asked Secretary Geithner specifically how this provision would be implemented. And Secretary Geithner assured us in his letter dated March the 5th, 2009, that, quote, regulations promulgated pursuant to that provision, i.e. 620, will seek to ensure that only travel for credible sales of food and medical products is authorized, the end of that quote. In his letter dated March the 9th, 2009, Secretary Geithner wrote, and I quote, the regulations promulgated pursuant to that provision would provide that representatives of only a narrow class of businesses would be eligible under a new general license to travel to Cuba to market and sell agricultural and medical goods. Any business using the general license would be required to provide both advance written notice outlining the purpose and the scope of the planned travel, and upon return, a report outlining the activities conducted, including the persons with whom they met, the expenses incurred, and businesses conducted in Cuba. End of quote. Section 622 concerns cash in advance payments. This provision would strip the Department of the Treasury's ability to enforce a 2005 amendment that defined the term cash in advance. In his March 5th letter, Secretary Geithner wrote that the United States Treasury, quote, believes that this change likely will have no influence on current financing rules. The term cash in advance is in the Trade Sanctions the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, and therefore private parties are and will continue to be statutorily required to comply with those payment terms. Because the bill's language does not modify or negate the statutory requirement in the 2000 Act, exporters will still be required to receive payment in advance of shipment and will not be permitted to export to Cuba on credit other than through third country banks, which is the law today. That's the end of that quote. And this comes particularly at a moment that is very important. The Paris Club recently announced that Cuba has defaulted on over $30 billion of obligations, and at a time that we are facing challenges here in the United States in terms of our financial institutions and credit in general, to be giving credit to a country that has not only a repressive policy but has $30 billion in defaults is not, in my mind, good policy. President Obama said that, quote, "My policy towards Cuba will be guided by one word, libertad, which means freedom. And the road to freedom for all Cubans must begin with justice for Cuba's political prisoners, the rights of free speech, a free press, and freedom of assembly, and it must lead to elections that are free and fair." The end of that quote. And I couldn't agree more with President Obama on this point and fully support him in moving forward in this direction. Finally, I know that some of my colleagues might be confused about my persistence with this issue over the last couple of weeks. So let me clarify it. What for me is a principled position. First, I have many citizens in New Jersey whose personal stories speak powerfully to the repression of the Castro regime. Many of them have spent 10 to 20 years of their life in a prison cell. Their only crime was trying to seek peaceful change in their country. They are now proud United States citizens, but they languished in a jail for a decade or 2 decades simply for seeking to make peaceful change. Many of them were tortured in that process. They are a powerful reminder to me every day when I am back in New Jersey of that reality. Second, let me propose that for some it's difficult to imagine the deep personal significance that these changes have for the human rights and democracy activists on the island that fight for the ability to speak freely and think freely, as well as my own personal convictions on this issue that my family has both lived under and died trying to change. Changes in our nation's policy towards Cuba, like changes in our nation's policy towards any nation that our country determines a state sponsor of terrorism, like Iran or Sudan and Syria, are extremely delicate policy issues. Any such changes in our policy with these countries deserves a democratic debate and careful deliberation. It is simply undemocratic to tuck them in the middle of a large, unrelated, but must-pass spending bill. So I want to thank Secretary Geithner for his understanding of the sensitivities of these issues and working with Senator Nelson and myself to ensure that the spirit of the legislation is carried out in a responsible manner. I also want to thank my colleagues in the Senate who have worked with us on this and others who have understood, and Majority Leader Reid for working with me on getting clarification on the implementation of these provisions. It's disappointing that the process unfolded this way. We will look just as unkindly upon any future attempts to make significant foreign policy decisions of any sort, not just about Cuba, in this type of secretive and undemocratic manner. Instead, I want to work with my colleagues in an open and transparent manner, deliberate the substance before we get to this point, even though at the end of the day we may still not find common ground. I would, of course, prefer that the provisions not be in this bill at all, but the assurances that I have received from Secretary Geithner have allayed my most significant concerns, and I will vote in favor of the Omnibus Appropriations Bill. With that, I want to yield to the distinguished senior senator from Florida, who has been an ally in this effort to ensure that the clarifications that were needed were there, and to who he is a tremendous advocate for freedom and democracy for the people of Cuba, and I've been privileged to work with him in getting these clarifications and making sure that we are in a position so that human rights activists and political dissidents in Cuba still have their opportunity to create change.
Senator from Florida.